Imagine the very first sound you hear isn't an alarm clock or a phone buzzing on the nightstand, but the soft crackle of a fire and the shuffle of people all around you. That was morning for early humans. Dawn didn't creep in with a gentle playlist or a coffee maker beeping. It came with the chill of the air on your skin, the flicker of light sneaking in through cracks of a cave or between animal hides, and the low grumbles of a whole group waking up together. Privacy didn't really exist. You didn't roll out of bed and have a quiet morning routine. You woke up shoulder to shoulder with family, cousins, and neighbors. If you snored, everyone knew. If a baby cried, everybody heard. And if the fire went out during the night, everyone felt it the moment they stirred awake. The fire was always the first concern. Before stretching, before water, before food, check the fire. If the flames had died down to just a glow, someone had to feed it quickly before it disappeared completely. A dead fire wasn't just annoying, it was a problem. Starting from scratch could take ages, and nobody wanted to be the unlucky person stuck rubbing sticks together for half the morning while everyone else shivered. So mornings often began with quiet urgency, blowing gently on embers, tucking in fresh twigs, coaxing that orange glow back to life. And then came the tools. Those precious stones and sharpened edges weren't decorative. They were the difference between eating and going hungry, between safety and danger. Every morning, someone would pick up a spear or a scraper, run their fingers along the edge, and see if it still held sharp. If it dulled overnight, it had to be fixed. Imagine the irritation of realizing your knife is too blunt to slice meat or scrape hide. That wasn't just inconvenient, it could ruin the whole day. Kids, of course, didn't care about the tools. They were usually the first to wake up, tumbling around, curious, noisy, and hungry. Their chatter filled the cave or the hut, bouncing off stone walls or rustling through hides. They'd ask for food, poke at the fire, maybe even tug on an adult's arm to drag them outside. Parents rolled their eyes but knew the kids' energy was useful. They'd soon be sent to gather sticks, fetch water, or tag along on small foraging tasks. Childhood didn't last long. By the time they were 10, they were expected to pitch in, not just play. For adults, waking up wasn't about easing into the day. There was no stretching lazily under warm blankets. No steaming mug of coffee to sip while staring at the sunrise. You got up because survival didn't wait. If you weren't moving, you weren't eating. If you weren't alert, you could be prey. And if you weren't careful, something sharp, or something with teeth, would remind you why mornings demanded attention. Survival wasn't about luxury, it was about constant readiness. The ground under them wasn't exactly a mattress. Most people slept on animal hides stretched over dirt, sometimes stuffed with dry grass to add a little padding. It wasn't comfortable in the modern sense, but it did the job. A soft spot on the earth meant you woke up without too many aches. A rough patch meant you spent half the day stretching out sore shoulders. It sounds miserable to us now, but back then, if you had hides, grass, and a fire, you were already better off than many. Temperature shaped every morning too. In the summer, waking meant sticky warmth, flies buzzing around, and the faint smell of smoke mixing with sweat. In the winter, it was worse. Cold air bit at your skin the moment you stirred, and the temptation to burrow deeper under hides was strong. But there was no snooze button. The fire needed tending, the day's work had to begin, and the cold wouldn't wait for you to be ready. That first step outside on a frosty morning must have felt like walking straight into a challenge. The kind of challenge where your breath fogged up in front of you and your toes begged for warmth. Every little sound mattered, too. The morning wasn't quiet in the peaceful sense. You had the crack of firewood, the cough of someone fighting smoke or illness, the shuffle of feet, and sometimes the distant cry of an animal. Each noise meant something. Was that a bird signaling the season? Was it another group nearby? Was it a predator moving too close? Your ears never really rested. Even in sleep, people stayed half alert, the way we might jerk awake at a sudden noise in the night. For them, That instinct wasn't a quirk. It was survival. Sometimes mornings began with small rituals, not in a religious sense, but in the steady habits that made life manageable. Sharpening tools, braiding hair out of the way, rubbing ash or fat into skin to keep insects at bay. A woman might check the hides for wear and tear. A man might carve at a spear shaft, and someone always checked if the water source was still safe. These weren't glamorous tasks, but together they formed the rhythm of life. And then there were the moods. Imagine waking up hungry, cold and sore, only to find the fire dead or the food supply gone. People got cranky, and cranky wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Arguments could start quickly. Who forgot the fire? Who took the last piece of dried meat? Who left the spear where it shouldn't be? In small groups, tempers flared fast. But just as fast, they had to cool down, because cooperation wasn't optional. You couldn't afford grudges when you depended on one another for survival. So mornings often saw a mix of grumbling laughter and uneasy peace, the kind that comes from knowing everyone's stuck in the same boat. There's something strangely relatable about all of this. Think about our own mornings, the rush, the little annoyances, the scramble to get everything together before the day truly starts. Cavemen didn't have alarms or traffic, but they had their own versions of stress. Fire instead of Wi-Fi, spears instead of car keys, hunger instead of coffee. And just like us, some mornings flowed smoothly, while others felt like the world was stacked against you before breakfast even began. The most striking thing, though, is how human it all feels. These weren't distant, strange beings. They were us, just in a different time. They stretched, they yawned, they got irritated at loud kids. They worried about the day ahead. They lived with constant danger, but also with constant familiarity. Each morning was a reminder of the fragile balance between safety and risk, comfort and struggle. And so the day began, not with luxury, but with survival. Waking up meant facing the unknown. Would food be found? Would the fire last? Would everyone make it through until nightfall? And yet, with each sunrise, they rose anyway. They checked the fire, they grabbed their tools, and they stepped into a world where every breath was earned. That was the morning routine of our ancestors, raw, practical, and endlessly human. Imagine waking up with your stomach already growling. That was normal. There wasn't a set breakfast waiting for you, no bread on the table, no fruit bowl, no steaming pot of oatmeal. Food was never guaranteed. In fact, most mornings started with the same question: what on earth are we going to eat today? If you were lucky, maybe last night's hunt had gone well. A strip of dried meat might still hang near the fire. Maybe someone had cracked open a bone and tucked away the marrow for later. Finding something like that in the morning was like winning the lottery. A small bite of leftovers meant you could start the day with energy, maybe even a smile. But those mornings were rare. More often, you crawled out of the hides with nothing but hunger pushing you forward. Breakfast wasn't a meal you planned. It was a scramble. People foraged, digging into the soil for roots, wandering out to check berry bushes, or poking at trees for nuts or honey. Sometimes you got lucky and came back with a handful of sweet fruit. Other times you gnawed on bitter leaves, convincing yourself it was better than nothing. And sometimes you came back with empty hands, the taste of disappointment mixing with the growl in your stomach. Seasons dictated the menu. Spring brought greens and tender plants. Summer meant berries, fruits, and the occasional burst of sweetness that felt like nature's gift. Autumn had nuts and seeds, little treasures that could be stored away for later. And winter was hard. The landscape went bare, animals disappeared, plants shriveled, and survival meant chewing on scraps and hoping the fire kept you warm enough to last until the world woke up again. Protein was unpredictable. Small animals, birds, rabbits, lizards, sometimes ended up in the pot, though pot isn't really the right word. Roasting was more common, skewering a catch over the flames or tossing it right into the fire and scraping off the charred bits later. And then there were insects, termites, grubs, grasshoppers. Nobody looked thrilled about eating them, but they were reliable, packed with protein, and easy to grab. Termite mounds could be smashed open for a quick meal. Grubs could be dug from rotting logs. They didn't taste great, but they also didn't fight back. That alone made them valuable. Sharing food was complicated. Within families, yes, you'd divide things, but in the larger group, generosity wasn't always guaranteed. Food meant survival, and survival meant power. If you came back with something tasty, you had leverage. Maybe you earned respect, maybe you bought goodwill, or maybe you just secured the best spot near the fire for the night. Food wasn't just calories. It was currency. Water mattered just as much, maybe even more. Streams, springs, or rivers were the best sources. If you were lucky, you lived near one. If not, you relied on puddles, melting snow, or rainwater caught in rocks. Boiling water wasn't always common yet, so people drank it raw. Sometimes it was fine. Sometimes it made the whole group sick. Your stomach had to be tough, your body ready to fight off whatever invisible hitchhikers came with that sip. And then there were the long stretches with nothing, whole mornings, even days, without enough food. That's where the feast or famine rhythm really showed. When a big animal went down, a deer, a boar, or the jackpot, a mammoth, the group feasted. Everyone ate until they couldn't anymore. Fires roared, bellies filled, grease dripped down chins. For a brief moment, life felt abundant. But the very next week, the meat was gone, the bones picked clean, and hunger crept back like an old rival you could never quite beat. The gamble of food shaped everything. Hunting promised massive rewards but came with huge risks. You could spend hours tracking, setting traps, chasing prey, only to return empty-handed. Foraging was steadier, less glamorous, but far more reliable. Plants didn't run away, roots didn't stab you, and berries, though small, didn't trample you if you picked them wrong. Foragers might not brag the way hunters did, but they were often the real heroes of survival. Children learned this early. They were sent to pick berries or dig for tubers, supervised at first, then left to figure it out. Along the way, they learned what was safe to eat and what could kill you. Trial and error wasn't just a phrase, it was reality. One wrong mushroom could end a life, so knowledge passed down carefully, often wrapped in stories and warnings told around the fire at night. Eat this leaf, you'll be fine. Eat that one, and you'll be joining the ancestors. But food wasn't only about filling the stomach. It shaped moods, relationships, even status. A hunter who dragged home meat earned glory. A gatherer who returned with a basket of nuts or fruit earned quiet gratitude. And a day when nobody found anything. That was a day full of snapping tempers, grumbling stomachs, and a heavy silence around the fire. Still, no matter how scarce or unpredictable it was, people always found a way. They chewed tougher roots, gnawed on bones for marrow, even scraped hides for the little bits of dried flesh left behind. Hunger pushed creativity, hunger forced invention, and hunger bound everyone together in the daily fight for survival. So when you think of prehistoric meals, don't picture 3 square ones with variety and choice. Picture uncertainty. Picture hope and disappointment mingled together every morning. Picture people crouching by bushes, chasing rabbits, smashing open termite mounds and sharing, or not sharing, what they found. That was the prehistoric buffet. Not glamorous, not predictable, but always essential. Every bite mattered, because every bite was another step closer to making it through the day. Picture a caveman sitting on the ground, hunched over, staring at 2 rocks with the focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Except this wasn't a hobby. This wasn't whittling wood on a lazy afternoon. This was survival, and every flake chipped off a stone meant the difference between eating dinner or going hungry, between defending the camp or running away empty-handed. Tools weren't accessories. They were lifelines. Most mornings, once the fire was steady and the kids were distracted with something to chew on, people turned their attention to tools. Spears, scrapers, knives. Each piece had to be checked, sharpened, fixed, or remade entirely. A dull edge wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Try skinning an animal with a blunt blade. and you risk wasting meat or worse, cutting yourself. And in a world without bandages or antibiotics, even a small wound could turn deadly. The raw materials were simple, but genius lay in how they were used. Flint was a favorite, sharp and dependable. Obsidian, if you happened to live near volcanic rock, was even better, slicing with edges finer than steel. But not everyone had access to the fancy stuff. Most had to make do with what the land offered: stones that chipped, bones that flexed, wood that could be shaped, sinew that tied everything together. There was no one-size-fits-all tool. Every piece had a purpose: hand axes for chopping, scrapers for hides, spear points for hunting, and pounding stones for, well, pounding whatever needed smashing. Making tools wasn't quick. It took patience and skill. Imagine spending hours knocking flakes off a rock, your hands sore, your back aching, only for the tip to snap off right when it finally looked perfect. That happened a lot. Some people had a knack for it, shaping points with smooth, practiced strikes. Others struggled, ending up with lopsided chunks that nobody really wanted. The ones with talent earned respect. A well-made spear point wasn't just useful, it was valuable. People might trade for it, offer food in exchange, or at the very least, pester you until you made one for them. And then came the brilliance of invention. Somewhere along the way, someone figured out the spear thrower, the atlal, a curved stick with a notch at the end. It turned an ordinary arm into a weapon with twice the reach and force. With an atlal, you could hurl a spear far harder and farther than by hand, fast enough to punch through hide and muscle. It changed hunting completely. Suddenly, people didn't have to charge headfirst into danger. They could attack from a distance, tipping the odds just a little more in their favor. Imagine the first time someone tested it, watching a spear fly farther than ever before. That must have felt like magic. But not every tool was flashy. Some were humble, even boring, yet equally important. Scrapers turned animal hides into clothing, blankets, or shelter coverings. Needles made from bone, with tiny carved eyes, allowed hides to be stitched together instead of just wrapped and tied. Those stitches kept out wind and cold, turning raw skins into real garments. Even hammerstones, the most basic of all tools, were indispensable. With them, you could crush bones for marrow or crack open nuts too tough to bite. Tool maintenance was an endless cycle. Sharpen, use, dull, repeat. Imagine sitting by the fire at night, sparks floating into the dark, while half the group knelt over stones, shaping new blades or repairing old ones. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Everyone chipped in, literally. And if you were too clumsy or too impatient, well, you probably ended up borrowing from someone else. But borrowing had a price. Nothing was free, not even a sharp edge. Tools also carried a sense of pride. Hunters bragged not only about the animals they caught, but about the spears they used. A finely shaped point wasn't just a tool, it was a story. The person who made it could point and say, "That's mine," when the group roasted meat later. Tools were proof of skill, and skill meant status. Of course, things broke. A spear point could shatter against bone, a scraper could wear down, a knife could chip mid-task. And when that happened, you didn't complain. You just got back to work. You couldn't afford to wait for the perfect blade. You needed something sharp right now. Even children learned early how to flake stone. Their first clumsy attempts often ended in bloody fingers, but those lessons were necessary. By the time they were grown, they could make a basic toolkit on their own. And let's not forget the improvisation. Sometimes you tied a rock to a stick with sinew and called it a hammer. Sometimes you carved a piece of antler into a wedge. Sometimes you used bones for fine work because they were lighter, more flexible, easier on the hands. Humans didn't just use what they had. They figured out new ways to make it work. Creativity wasn't a luxury, it was survival. When we think about technology, we picture glowing screens and gadgets that update every year. But for our ancestors, technology was right there in the dirt and stone. Every strike of a rock against another was a step forward, every sharper edge a tiny leap in survival. The atlal was their smartphone. A scraper was their washing machine. A hammer stone was their toolbox. And they guarded these creations fiercely, because without them, life was nearly impossible. So as the morning sun rose higher, and the group prepared to head out for food, the tools were ready. Spears leaned against the wall, scrapers tucked into belts, blades tucked into bags of hide. They weren't fancy, they weren't pretty, but they were everything. They were survival in your hand, and with those tools, the real work of the day could begin. Hunting, foraging, chasing the chance at a meal. The morning's work with tools wasn't for nothing. Once the fire was steady, the kids corralled, and the weapons sharpened, the main event of the day began: getting food. Hunting wasn't some casual stroll with a spear. It was life and death theatre played out under open skies, and it demanded teamwork in ways we can still relate to today. Big game was the dream. Mammoths, bison, wild horses. These weren't just animals, they were jackpots. One successful hunt could feed a band for days, maybe weeks, with enough meat to roast, fat to render, hides to wear, and bones to craft into tools. But they were also terrifying. A mammoth wasn't a slow, lumbering beast waiting patiently to be skewered. It was fast, angry, and strong enough to flatten a human like a twig. Going after one meant careful planning, serious coordination, and no small amount of courage. Scouts usually went out first, checking for herds, tracking prints in the dirt, watching the direction of the wind. If the signs looked good, the hunters followed. They set traps, pits covered with branches, choke points near rivers, even steep cliffs to corner their prey. Imagine dozens of people working together, shouting, waving spears, creating chaos to drive an animal right where they wanted it. The air filled with noise, dust, and adrenaline. And if everything went just right, the beast stumbled, the spears struck, and the kill was made. The cheer that must have gone up when a massive animal fell wasn't just excitement. It was survival locked in for another stretch of time. But the flip side, sometimes things went wrong. Maybe the wind shifted, carrying human scent straight to the herd. Maybe someone sneezed during an ambush. Maybe the animal turned and charged, scattering hunters like leaves. And when that happened, the hunting party returned with nothing but bruises, excuses, and growling stomachs waiting back at camp. The wind changed, was the prehistoric version of "my alarm didn't go off." Smaller game was a little more forgiving. Deer, boar, rabbits, birds. These were easier to chase, though not without their own frustrations. One bad throw and suddenly the whole group was sprinting after a squealing pig, laughing and cursing while trying not to trip over roots. Spears, clubs, snares, and nets all came into play. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes dinner ran into the trees and you went home empty-handed. And then there were the unsung heroes, the foragers. They didn't get the same bragging rights as the hunters, but they were the backbone of survival. While the hunters risked their lives against tusks and hooves, the foragers gathered what didn't fight back: berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, herbs. Plants were reliable. They didn't run, they didn't gore you, and they were usually there if you knew where to look. But knowing what was safe and what wasn't was tricky. Mistaking one root for another could mean the difference between a filling stew and a funeral. Foragers built mental maps of their world. This grove had edible nuts. That meadow sprouted tubers in spring. Over there, those mushrooms looked inviting but were pure trouble. Knowledge passed down carefully, often through stories told at night around the fire. Children learned by tagging along, listening, and sometimes, unfortunately, by trial and error. "Don't eat that, remember what happened last time," was a lesson carved deep into memory. And foraging wasn't boring either. Sometimes it meant competing with wildlife. Birds swooped down for berries, squirrels hoarded nuts before humans could reach them, and the occasional bear made a forager's day far too exciting. Even bees had to be dealt with if you wanted honey, and stepping into a wasp nest was a mistake you never repeated willingly. Still, gathering plants was steadier than hunting. Plants didn't trample you. Nuts didn't stab you, and roots didn't demand that you run full speed with a spear in your hand. While hunters earned glory, foragers quietly made sure the band didn't starve. Both groups needed each other. Hunters brought feasts, foragers brought consistency, and together they made survival possible. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was social glue. A successful hunt meant pride, respect, and often first pick of the meat. A full basket of berries meant gratitude, relief, and maybe a little less pressure on the next hunt. Every bite mattered, every roll counted, and when the day's work was done, whether triumphant with a kill or relieved with a handful of roots and nuts, everyone knew the truth: tomorrow, it would all begin again. The hunt, the forage, the gamble of survival. Because in that world, food wasn't just about eating. It was about teamwork, trust, and the relentless push forward. If there was one thing that separated survival from disaster, it was fire. Fire wasn't just light. It wasn't just heat. It was life itself. Without it, the night became an endless stretch of darkness. Cold air bit down harder, and predators felt braver. With it, people had warmth, a circle of safety, a place to cook food, and even a bit of comfort at the end of a hard day. Fire was the beating heart of every camp, and keeping it alive was just as important as breathing. Nobody ever wanted to start fire from scratch. It wasn't as simple as striking a match. It meant twirling sticks together until smoke appeared, blowing gently until a tiny ember caught, then praying it grew into flame. Damp wood, forget it. Cold hands, good luck. This process could take hours, which is why the unspoken rule was simple: don't let the fire die. Someone always kept watch, sometimes during travel. A glowing coal was carried in moss or bark, carefully protected like a treasure, so the flame could be revived when the group stopped. It was a fragile lifeline wrapped in smoke. Fire also meant food could be cooked, turning raw meat into something safer and easier to chew. Imagine the first humans who discovered that roasting a piece of meat over flames not only made it taste better, but kept them from getting sick. That was a revelation, a discovery as world-changing as the smartphone is to us today. And it wasn't just meat. Roots softened, nuts roasted, herbs boiled into makeshift teas. Fire made the inedible edible. It stretched survival in ways nothing else could. But fire wasn't only practical. It was social. The campfire became the living room of the Stone Age. People circled around it after a long day, sharing food, trading stories, laughing, arguing, teaching children what to avoid in the forest, or how to sharpen a blade. It was warmth against the cold, light against the shadows, and community against loneliness. Without the fire, the group was just a handful of individuals. With it, they were a tribe. Now, shelter. Not every prehistoric person lived in a cave, no matter what cartoons make us think. Caves were great if you found one. Natural protection, solid walls, steady temperature. But caves were rare, and sometimes already occupied by animals you definitely didn't want to argue with. So humans built their own. The shelters weren't pretty, but they worked. Frames of wood, or even mammoth bones lashed together with sinew or vines, covered with animal hides, bark, grass, or packed earth. They weren't mansions, but they kept out wind and rain. A winter shelter might be heavier, built to hold against snow. A summer hut might be lighter, something you could abandon when the group moved. Function came first. Looks didn't matter. If it didn't leak too badly and didn't collapse during a storm, it was considered a success. Inside, there wasn't much. No beds, no chairs, no decorations. A pile of hides for sleeping. A rock used as a seat. Maybe a corner that stayed a little warmer than the rest. The fire usually burned in the center, smoke drifting out through a hole above. Or not, depending on how well it was built. More than one group probably coughed their way through nights in half-smoky shelters, eyes watering while they tried to sleep. Comfort was relative. A dry floor was a luxury. A draft-free corner was paradise. Still, people made it work. They layered hides on the ground, shared warmth in tight groups, and used smoke not just for cooking, but for keeping bugs away. Sometimes fat or ash was rubbed into skin for protection against insects. Sometimes dirt itself became a shield. Not glamorous, but surprisingly effective. Daily comforts were small and practical. A good fire, a hide that didn't smell too bad, a roof that didn't collapse in the rain, and maybe a full belly if the day's hunting or foraging had gone well. That was luxury in their world. And yet, these simple shelters and fires gave more than just physical protection. They gave a sense of place, of belonging. Returning to a campfire after a long, cold day of hunting or gathering must have felt like stepping into warmth, not just for the body, but for the soul. It was home, even if home was just a smoky hut with dripping hides and a floor of dirt. When we think of comfort today, we imagine soft beds, electric lights, hot showers. But for them, comfort was far more primal, not freezing to death, not being eaten in the dark, and having enough energy to try again tomorrow. Shelter and fire gave them that. They gave them the margin between life and death. And so, every day the cycle repeated: gather fuel, tend the fire, patch the roof, huddle together. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in that dim, smoky glow, surrounded by family and tribe, our ancestors found enough comfort to keep going. There were no strollers, no cribs, no sippy cups lined up in the corner. Parenting in the Stone Age was raw, demanding, and relentless. The moment a baby was born, life changed, and not in the diapers and daycare way we imagine today. It was about keeping a fragile, crying little human alive in a world filled with sharp rocks, wild animals, and freezing nights. Childbirth itself was already a gamble. Painful, risky, and without medicine, every birth was a test of strength for both the mother and the baby. The group helped, of course, midwives in the form of older women or experienced mothered assist, offering whatever comfort and knowledge they had. If both mother and child survived, there was relief, maybe even quiet celebration. But no one forgot how thin the line was between life and death. Once a baby arrived, the work really began. Forget bottles or formula, breastfeeding was the only option. Mothers often nursed for years, because solid food wasn't always safe or easy for small children. Toddlers got soft, chewed bits of meat, mashed roots, or berries carefully selected to avoid poisoning. Feeding a child wasn't just about nutrition. It was about passing on the wisdom of what was safe to eat and what would leave you doubled over in pain. And diapers, non-existent. Babies were swaddled in hides or soft plant fibers, and when messes happened, well, you just dealt with them. Parents learned quickly that rocks were easier to clean than animal skins, so babies often got set down on stones. Practical solutions ruled everything. Danger was everywhere, so kids had to learn fast. If a child wandered too close to a fire, they weren't given a timeout. They were yanked back by the leg with a sharp command. No! If they leaned too far over a cliff or chased after something dangerous, the lesson was immediate and blunt. Survival didn't allow for gentle corrections. The stakes were too high. A burned hand or scraped knee was a painful teacher, but better than the alternative. But don't picture parenting as only harsh. Kids brought joy too. Their laughter, their curiosity, their endless energy kept the camp alive in ways food and fire couldn't. They played constantly, inventing games with sticks, stones, feathers, and whatever else they could find. Play wasn't just fun, it was training. A child who threw rocks at trees might grow into the group's best hunter. One who copied the healer, crushing herbs into mush, might become the shaman one day. Childhood was short, but it was full of discovery. By the time they were 10, children were no longer seen as just kids. They were small adults, expected to gather firewood, fetch water, scare birds away from drying meat, or help carry hides. Annoying sometimes, definitely, but useful. Each new skill pulled them closer to being a full part of the tribe. They weren't asked what they wanted to be when they grew up. Their role revealed itself through daily life. And while formal education didn't exist, teaching was constant. Kids learned by watching, copying, and repeating until the lesson stuck. They learned how to spot safe berries, how to sharpen a scraper, how to avoid snakes, and how to keep the fire alive. They didn't have books, but they had the wisdom of their elders, passed down through stories, gestures, and endless reminders. Trial and error was the classroom. Parenting was never done alone. The whole band looked after children. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even older siblings, everyone helped. If a mother was busy foraging, someone else held the baby. If a father was out hunting, an uncle might show a child how to shape a stick into a toy spear. It was community-based parenting, survival style. And in a world where every life counted, raising a child was everyone's responsibility. There were sweet moments, too. A baby asleep against a mother's chest while she worked hides. A toddler wobbling after an older sibling, clutching a stick like it was a spear. Kids curling up next to parents at night, warm and safe under the shared hides, drifting to sleep to the sound of fire crackling and adults whispering nearby. Despite all the danger, love still existed, shown through touch, protection, and the relentless work of keeping the little ones alive. Growing up meant adapting quickly. Childhood wasn't a long, carefree stage of life. It was a short, crucial window to learn how to survive. By the time a child hit their teens, they were expected to contribute fully. Hunting, foraging, building, caring for younger siblings. Their innocence ended early, but in return, they gained a deep connection to their world and their people. Parenting in the Stone Age wasn't gentle, but it was fierce, devoted, and unyielding. Children weren't coddled, but they were treasured. Every child carried the future of the group. Every small pair of hands meant more help when times got hard. Raising kids was never easy, but it was always worth it. When the sun dropped and shadows stretched long across the land, the work of the day slowed down. Spears were leaned against walls, baskets of berries set aside, hides folded neatly, or not so neatly, by the fire. Evening was when the camp came together. No matter how hard the day had been, no matter how empty or full the stomachs, everyone circled the flames because fire wasn't just warmth, it was community. Picture it, the night pressing in, cold air nipping at ears and fingers, and the fire throwing orange light that danced across faces. Smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of roasted meat or cracked bones sizzling in the embers. Around this circle, the tribe came alive in a different way. The morning was about survival. The night was about connection. This was when the stories started. Humans have always been storytellers, and our ancestors were no different. Someone would lean forward, eyes wide, hands gesturing, telling how the hunt had gone. Every twist, every stumble, every near miss. A boar might become bigger, scarier, faster in the retelling. A hunter's throw might fly straighter, harder, more heroic than it had in reality. Exaggeration wasn't lying. It was entertainment. Kids listened with mouths open, adults chuckled knowingly, and even the tired hunters grinned at the dramatics. But these stories weren't only for laughs. They carried knowledge. Warnings about poisonous plants were wrapped into tales of foolish cousins who ate the wrong root and spent 3 days seeing spirits. Tricks for hunting or foraging were tucked into sagas about ancestors outsmarting animals. Myths about spirits, the moon, or the thunder gave shape to mysteries the tribe couldn't explain. Around the fire, history, teaching, and imagination melted into one. Music found its place here too. Someone might bang 2 stones together in a steady rhythm. Someone else might hum or chant. A hollow bone could whistle, a stretched hide could thump like a drum. Soon children would start dancing, twirling in the firelight, their shadows leaping on the walls like spirits of their own. It wasn't polished, but it didn't need to be. The beat was primal, the joy contagious. For a little while hunger, cold, and danger faded away, replaced by laughter and rhythm. And, of course, bragging always happened. Hunters who had scored big kills told the story more than once, each time with extra flair. A gatherer who found a hidden patch of berries made sure everyone knew. Even toolmakers showed off, casually pulling a newly sharpened scraper from their belt, pretending it was no big deal while clearly hoping for admiration. Social standing wasn't measured by money or property. It was about skill. Who kept the fire alive? Who brought in food? Who made tools that lasted? Status was earned by action, and the firelight was the stage where it was displayed. Flirting slipped in too, subtle, quiet, but there. A piece of meat shared without being asked, a spot closer to the fire offered, a laugh held a little longer than usual, in a world where options were limited. Maybe 20 or 30 people in your entire group. Courtship was practical. No flowers, no songs, just small gestures that carried big meaning. Relationships often formed here, in the glow of flames side by side, with nothing but sparks drifting upward and the steady hum of voices. For kids, the fire was magic. They stayed up as long as they could, eyes wide, soaking in every tale, every rhythm, every burst of laughter. They learned here as much as they did while working. The stories gave them rules, warnings, and dreams. The songs gave them rhythm. The dancing gave them freedom. And when their eyelids finally drooped, they curled against parents or siblings, lulled to sleep by the rise and fall of voices and the pop of wood in the flames. Adults lingered longer. Some stared into the fire, lost in thought. Others whispered plans for tomorrow's hunt or arguments about where to move next. Disagreements happened, of course. Whose turn was it to fetch wood? Who ate more than their share? Who slacked during the hunt? But the fire also helped settle disputes. Talking in its light, with the whole group listening, made people think twice before letting anger spill too far. The fire was more than a tool. It was the heart of the community. It lit faces, warmed bodies, and gave everyone a reason to sit together at the end of long, brutal days. Around it, laughter echoed, stories lived, romances sparked, and bonds grew stronger. And when the flames burned low, and the sparks turned to glowing embers, one last person always checked. They leaned in, made sure the coals were alive, tucked in extra wood if needed. Because if the fire went out, the warmth, the safety, the community it created, all of it disappeared into the cold night. So every evening ended the same way it began, with fire, with people together, and with the reminder that survival wasn't just about food or tools. It was about connection, and the fire, more than anything, was what kept that connection alive. Even in a world where every day was about finding food and staying alive, humans still carved out time for something more, something bigger than just survival. They made art. And that might be the most human thing of all. Imagine stepping into a cave, torchlight flickering against rough stone walls. Deep inside, far past where anyone slept, you see them lines of animals drawn in red ochre, black charcoal, and yellow pigments. Horses running, bison charging, deer leaping, mammoths towering with heavy tusks. The figures seem alive, as if they might gallop right off the walls. This wasn't graffiti. This wasn't boredom scribbled on stone. This was intentional. It was storytelling. It was expression. It was magic. We don't know for sure why they painted. Maybe it was part of rituals, calling on spirits for luck before a hunt. Maybe it was to teach, to show children which animals to chase and which to avoid. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because someone simply wanted to. Because the urge to create, to capture, to leave a mark, is something that has always lived inside us. The tools were simple. Pigments made from crushed minerals mixed with water, fat, or even spit. Brushes were fingers, sticks, or chewed-up plants. Sometimes hollow bones were used to blow paint across stenciled hands. The first spray paint long before the word existed. Those handprints are still there, tiny palms pressed against the stone. Some belong to adults. Some, smaller ones, to children. Whole families may have left their signatures, marking their presence across thousands of years. And the paintings weren't random. Many show motion, legs bent, lines trailing to suggest speed, arrows striking into hides. Some are covered with dots or symbols we still can't fully decode. Were they calendars, ritual markings, personal signatures? We don't know. But we do know this people went deep into caves, into dangerous, pitch-black spaces, just to paint. They carried torches, mixed pigments, risked smoke and suffocation, all for the sake of leaving something behind. That means it mattered, deeply. Art wasn't only on walls. Carvings were made into bone, antler and stone. Small figurines of animals or of human forms, some with exaggerated features like wide hips and round bellies, symbols of fertility and life. These Venus figures, as archaeologists call them today, may have represented hope, abundance, or the continuation of the family line. Whatever their meaning, they were more than decoration. They were belief made solid. Music was art too. Around the fire, rhythm and melody became as important as stories. Hollow bird bones turned into flutes, producing eerie, haunting tunes that floated across the camp. Animal hides stretched over frames became drums. Stones clacked, sticks rattled, voices rose in chants. Music wasn't polished, but it didn't need to be. It echoed through the night, giving people rhythm to dance, release to laugh, and a beat to bind them together. And then there was body art. Ash rubbed into hair, ochre smeared on skin, feathers tucked into braids, shells or bones strung into necklaces. These weren't fashion statements the way we think of them now. They carried meaning. Maybe a necklace showed skill in hunting. Maybe a smear of paint was protection in battle. Maybe bright feathers marked someone as a healer, or a leader, or just someone who wanted to stand out. Humans didn't only shape the world around them, they shaped themselves, turning their very bodies into canvases. The incredible part, these creations outlasted everything else. The shelters rotted, the fires burned to ash, the bones returned to dust, but the paintings remain. The carvings endure. The flutes still whistle when played. Across tens of thousands of years, their art still speaks to us. It says, "We were here. We lived. We dreamed. We imagined." What's beautiful is how familiar it all feels. Think about kids today doodling on walls, drawing shapes that parents may or may not approve of. Imagine them back then, pressing tiny hands to stone, blowing pigment over fingers, and giggling at the outline left behind. Think about someone carefully carving a figurine, turning it over in their hands, proud of what they made. Or someone humming a tune into the night, unaware they were creating the very beginnings of music. It tells us that humans, even at their most vulnerable, needed more than food and fire. They needed beauty. They needed meaning. They needed a way to take what lived inside their heads and put it into the world. That need, that urge to create, is one of the oldest truths we share with them. So when you picture cavemen, don't just see scruffy hunters with spears. See artists crouched in firelight, painting dreams onto stone. See children leaving handprints that would outlast empires. See a group tired and hungry, still finding energy to carve, sing, dance, and decorate themselves. Survival gave them purpose. Art gave them soul. Getting sick or hurt in the Stone Age wasn't just inconvenient. It was terrifying. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no bandages sealed in plastic wrappers. A broken bone, a deep cut, even a tooth hatch could be the difference between living and not making it through the season. Every injury, every fever, every infection was a gamble with the universe, and the odds weren't always kind. But here's the fascinating part: early humans didn't just sit back and let fate decide. They experimented, adapted, and found ways, rough and imperfect, but ways nonetheless, to heal. Let's start with injuries. Cuts and scrapes were constant. Hunting meant sharp spears and tusks. Foraging meant thorn bushes and poisonous plants. Building shelters meant splinters, bruises, and crushed fingers. When someone got hurt, the first step was simple: clean the wound. Water from a stream, sometimes herbs crushed into poultices, sometimes even moss packed over a cut to soak up blood. They didn't have sterile bandages, but they used what they had. Infection was the real enemy, and while they couldn't see germs, they knew when something was turning bad. A wound that swelled, turned hot, or began to smell spelled danger. Some lived, some didn't. But even then, they tried. Broken bones. Believe it or not, many healed. Archaeologists have found skeletons with fractures that knitted back together, proof that care was given. Maybe a limb was splintered with wood, wrapped in hide, and kept still. Maybe the whole group slowed down so the injured person could keep up. That shows something incredible. Even in harsh times, people looked after each other. Survival wasn't just individual, it was shared. Tooth hatches were another nightmare. Cavemen didn't eat candy, but their food was gritty, tough, full of sand and stone dust from grinding grains. Teeth wore down fast. Cavities, abscesses, and broken molars hurt more than we can imagine. And yet, evidence shows some brave souls actually performed early dentistry. In one case, a person's rotten tooth was scraped clean with a sharp stone tool and then filled with sticky tar like resin to block infection. No numbing, no chair. Just grit your teeth, literally, and endure. Pain was constant, but so was ingenuity. As for medicine, plants were the first pharmacy. Chewing willow bark eased pain, the same ingredient we use today in aspirin. Roots and herbs were crushed for poultices, teas, or even smoke for inhaling. Some worked, others didn't. And yes, sometimes the cure was worse than the sickness. But each attempt added to the group's knowledge. Over time, they built mental catalogues of what healed, what soothed, and what killed. Shamans or healers carried much of this knowledge. They weren't doctors in the modern sense, but they were part herbalist, part spiritual guide, part risk-taker. They used plants, chants, smoke, maybe even hallucinogens, to treat both body and spirit. Sometimes their remedies worked. Sometimes it was luck. Sometimes it was belief itself that helped. Placebo or not, it gave people hope. And hope, when you were sick or hurt, mattered. But medicine wasn't only about plants. Tricks for survival popped up everywhere. Animal fat rubbed on skin kept bugs away. Rolling in dirt or even animal carcasses. Yes, it sounds disgusting. Masked human scent and helped hunters get close to prey. Ash in the hair cut down on lice. Smoke wasn't just warmth, it was pest control. These little hacks, discovered through trial and error, added precious layers of protection against a dangerous world. Illness still struck, though. Fevers, coughs, stomach bugs. Sometimes people recovered, sometimes they didn't. But community was key. If one person got sick, the group adjusted, sharing food, taking on chores, waiting it out together. The evidence of healed bones and old injuries tells us that care wasn't rare. Compassion was as vital to survival as spears or fire. Imagine someone sitting by the fire, leg bound in a hide splint, being fed bits of roasted meat by family members. Or a child crying with a toothache, soothed by a parent chewing herbs and pressing the mash against their swollen gum. Or a shaman chanting in the smoky dark, crushing plants into strange brews, hoping something in the mix would help. These moments are deeply human. They remind us that even in the roughest times, people looked out for one another. What's astonishing is how much of their knowledge still echoes today. Willow bark to aspirin, resin for dental fillings, herbal teas for soothing pain. They didn't have the science, but they had instinct, observation, and courage to try. And in many cases that was enough. So while the Stone Age was brutal, it wasn't hopeless. Illness and injury were real threats, but humans fought back with creativity, care, and community. They didn't always win, but they never stopped trying, and that determination to heal, to fix, to protect, that's just as much a part of our story as hunting or fire. For all the warmth of the fire and the comfort of a shelter, life in the Stone Age was never still. People were movers. They had to be. The land gave, but it also took away. A valley rich with berries in spring turned empty by winter. A river teeming with fish 1 month ran dry the next. Herds of animals moved on, and humans had no choice but to follow. So imagine waking up one morning and realizing it was time to leave. Not just for the day, but for good. Everything had to be packed: tools, hides, baskets, weapons, whatever food remained. And, of course, the fire. Someone carefully carried a glowing coal wrapped in moss or bark, like carrying the heart of the camp itself. Without that ember, starting fresh flames could take hours of exhausting effort. Losing it wasn't an option. Travel was never easy. There were no wagons, no wheels, no paved roads. Just feet. Every mile was walked, every burden carried. Children were slung onto hips or backs. Baskets were strapped with hide slings, and heavier loads were dragged across the ground. The old, the young, the strong, everyone moved together, because being left behind meant being lost. The pace was slow, steady, but relentless. 10, 12, maybe 20 miles in a day if conditions were good. Hills, rivers, forests, snow. The earth threw obstacles at every step. rain-soaked hides. Winds bit into faces, heat cracked lips and burned skin. Yet still they moved, because to stay in one place too long meant starvation. Navigation wasn't about maps. It was about memory. Landmarks became guides. That mountain shaped like a sleeping bear. That bend in the river where the air smelled sweet. That cluster of trees where the berries grew last summer. Elders carried these maps in their heads and passed them down in stories and songs. At night, the stars helped too, patterns in the sky guiding groups across vast plains and deserts. And this wasn't just small travel. Over thousands of years, humans crossed entire continents on foot. Step by step, they spread out of Africa, through Asia, into Europe, across land bridges into the Americas, even into islands far out in the oceans. No GPS, no guides, just instinct, memory, and the sheer drive to keep moving forward. But travel wasn't only about survival, it shaped identity. Moving meant meeting new landscapes, new challenges, even new people. Sometimes strangers were welcomed, knowledge and goods exchanged. Other times, encounters turned violent. Resources were scarce, and survival didn't leave much room for generosity. Still, every meeting left a mark. Ideas spread, tools improved, stories traveled farther than footsteps. Children learned resilience on these journeys. They trudged through mud, stumbled over rocks, complained, cried. But they also grew tougher. By the time they were old enough to carry their own baskets, migration was already second nature. Home wasn't a fixed place. Home was wherever the fire was lit that night. Evenings on the move had their own rhythm. The group would stop near water or shelter, rebuild the fire, and share what little they had gathered along the way. Meat roasted, roots boiled, and stories told again, this time under new skies. The familiar circle of fire remained, even as the world around it changed. That ritual gave continuity, a reminder that even while the land shifted, the people stayed connected. And sometimes, movement wasn't just survival, it was curiosity. What lay beyond the next hill, the next river, the next mountain range? That restless spark pushed humans farther and farther, until they reached places no one had ever seen before. It wasn't only necessity that drove them, it was wonder. The traces of these journeys are still with us. Footprints fossilized in ancient mud, paths carved into stone, tools left behind in caves thousands of miles apart. They remind us that migration wasn't a side note to human history. It was human history. To move, to explore, to adapt. It's in our bones. And so, at the end of each day, after walking for miles with sore feet and heavy loads, early humans gathered again around their fire. They ate what they could, huddled together, and looked out into the dark, knowing tomorrow they'd walk again. Their lives were hard, their struggles endless, but their determination unshakable. Step by step, camp by camp, they carried humanity forward. That was the rhythm of the Stone Age, never still, always moving, always chasing survival and something more. The horizon, the unknown, the promise of what lay beyond.